There's a financial decision that millions of people make every single year, believing it's the smartest move they could possibly make for their future. They save up for years, they work overtime, they sacrifice vacations and experiences, all to accumulate enough money for one thing: a down payment on a house. And when they finally make that purchase, they feel like they've arrived. They've achieved something important. They're building equity. They're investing in their future. But what if I told you that this decision, the one that nearly everyone celebrates as a major life milestone, might actually be one of the most inefficient uses of your money you could make during your wealth-building years? Now, before you close this video thinking this is just another contrarian hot take designed to get clicks, hear me out. Because what I'm about to share with you isn't based on theory or ideology. It's based on decades of observation, mathematical reality, and the actual outcomes I've witnessed from people who chose different paths. Some people spent their prime earning years putting every spare dollar into home ownership. Others took that same money and directed it toward investments. And the wealth gap between these two groups 30 years later is absolutely staggering, far larger than most people would ever imagine. Let's start by examining what you're actually committing to when you buy a house. Most people think about the purchase price and maybe the monthly mortgage payment, but they rarely calculate the true total cost of ownership over the life of that decision. When someone buys a $400,000 house, they're not actually spending $400,000. They're committing to something far more expensive, and understanding this difference is absolutely critical. You'll typically put down 20%, which is $80,000 that immediately comes out of your investment potential. Then you finance the remaining $320,000 at current interest rates. Over a 30-year mortgage, you're not just paying back that principal, you're also paying hundreds of thousands in interest to the bank. Your monthly payment might be around $2,000, but over 3 decades, the total of those payments adds up to well over $700,000. You've essentially paid for the house twice just in mortgage payments alone. But the real costs are only beginning. Property taxes are going to run you thousands per year, and they never stop. Even after you've paid off that mortgage completely, you'll still owe property taxes every single year for as long as you own the home. Insurance is another ongoing expense that many first-time buyers underestimate. And then there's maintenance and repairs, which financial experts suggest you should budget at least 1 to 2% of your home's value annually. That's $4,000 to $8,000 every single year for things that will inevitably break, wear out, or need updating. Roofs don't last forever. HVAC systems fail. Plumbing needs work. Appliances break down. And unlike renting, where you call the landlord when something breaks, as a homeowner, every one of these problems comes out of your pocket. Many neighborhoods also have homeowner association fees, which can easily run several $100s monthly in newer developments. And because houses are generally larger than rental units, your utility costs are typically higher as well. Then there are the transaction costs that people forget about. You paid several thousand in closing costs when you bought the property, and when you eventually sell, you're going to pay roughly 6% in realtor commissions, which on a $600,000 sale is $36,000 just gone. When you add up every single one of these expenses over a 30-year period, the down payment, all the mortgage payments, the property taxes, the insurance, the maintenance, the HOA fees, the extra utilities, and the transaction costs, you're looking at a total outlay somewhere around $1.5 million. You spent $1.5 million to own something you initially bought for $400,000. Now here's where the math becomes truly eye-opening. Let's talk about what financial experts call opportunity cost, which is the value of what you gave up by choosing one option over another. That $80,000 down payment you made, what could it have become if you'd invested it instead? Historical market returns suggest that money could have grown to well over $1 million in 30 years. The difference between your mortgage payment and what you could have been paying in rent, let's say around $600 per month, if you'd invested that difference consistently, you'd have accumulated another $1 to $1.5 million. So by choosing to buy that house, you didn't just spend $1.5 million in direct costs. You also gave up roughly $2 to $3 million in potential investment growth. Think about that for a moment. The house you bought for $400,000, which might be worth $600,000 in inflation-adjusted dollars 3 decades later, actually cost you somewhere between $3 and $4 million, when you account for what you spent plus what you could have earned by investing differently. Meanwhile, If you'd rented a modest place and invested aggressively, you could potentially be sitting on multiple millions in liquid assets that generate passive income. One path gives you a paid-off house and minimal savings. The other path gives you true financial independence and the freedom to retire early if you choose. These are radically different outcomes from the same starting point. So why does nearly everyone believe that buying a house is the smart financial move when the math suggests otherwise? There are several powerful forces at work here, and understanding them helps explain why this belief is so deeply embedded in our culture. First, there's an entire industry built around selling homes. Real estate agents, mortgage lenders, home builders, these businesses profit enormously when people buy houses. They're not going to run advertising campaigns suggesting that renting might be smarter. Banks make tremendous money on mortgages, earning hundreds of thousands in interest from each loan. Government policy also encourages homeownership through tax deductions and subsidies, partly because housing construction is a massive economic driver and homeowners tend to be more politically engaged. There's also a generational disconnect that's important to understand. People who bought homes in the 1960s and 70s got extraordinarily lucky with timing. Houses back then cost roughly 2 to 3 times the median annual income. Today, in most cities, houses cost 6 to 10 times median income. The math that made homeownership a good deal for previous generations simply doesn't work the same way in today's economic environment. But those earlier generations don't realize how much the equation has changed, so they give advice based on a world that no longer exists. Psychologically, there's also something called post-purchase rationalization. Once people have made a major financial commitment, they need to believe it was the right decision, so they'll find every possible way to justify it, even when the numbers don't support their reasoning. They'll talk about building equity and not throwing money away on rent, but these are emotional arguments, not financial analysis. Equity that's locked in a liquid asset you can't easily access isn't the same thing as wealth you can actually use. This brings up a critical distinction that many people miss. They confuse net worth on paper with actual financial freedom. Yes, after 30 years of payments, you own an asset worth $600,000, and that increases your net worth on a balance sheet. But can you spend that equity? Not unless you sell the house, and then where will you live? You'll have to buy another property or pay rent anyway. True wealth isn't just numbers on paper, it's liquid assets that generate income and give you options. A paid-off house generates zero income unless you rent it out. It just sits there continuing to cost you property taxes and maintenance while your money remains trapped in an illiquid asset. This is why you see so many people who appear wealthy on paper but are actually struggling financially. They have $600,000 in home equity but only $20,000 or $30,000 in retirement savings. They're house rich and cash poor, unable to retire comfortably because their wealth is tied up in something they can't access without selling their home. Now, I want to be clear about something. I'm not suggesting that buying a house is always wrong in every situation. There are specific scenarios where it can make sense, but they're more limited than most people realize. If you're absolutely certain you'll stay in the same location for 15 or more years, the transaction costs of buying and selling can be spread over enough time that the math improves. But you need to be honest with yourself about this. Most people move every 7 to 10 years, and if you sell that soon, you've likely lost money on transaction costs alone. Buying can also make sense if you find a property significantly below market value, perhaps a foreclosure or estate sale where you're getting instant equity, but this requires expertise, patience, and usually cash, not just showing up at an open house and making an offer. Another scenario where buying makes sense is what's called house hacking, where you purchase a multi-unit property, live in one unit, and rent out the others. If the rental income covers your costs, you're essentially living for free while building equity. But notice this isn't buying a single-family home to live in. This is purchasing an income-producing asset that happens to include a unit where you live. That's actual investing, not traditional home ownership. If housing in your area is unusually affordable relative to incomes, buying might make sense. In some smaller towns or rural areas, you can buy a house with monthly costs comparable to renting, so the opportunity cost is minimal. And finally, if you've already achieved financial independence with several million invested, then buying a house with cash is perfectly fine. At that point, you've already won financially, and you can afford to make consumption choices without sacrificing your wealth-building potential. But here's the key insight. For most people under 50 who are still building wealth, In most housing markets today, you face a choice. You can own a house, or you can become wealthy. But the math often doesn't allow for both simultaneously. If you choose the house now, you'll spend your prime earning years making mortgage payments, paying property taxes, and handling repairs. You'll reach retirement age with a paid-off house worth $600,000 and maybe $100,000 in retirement savings. You'll be house rich and cash poor, forced to work longer because you can't afford to retire comfortably. If instead you choose to build wealth first by renting modestly and investing aggressively, you could reach retirement with several million in liquid assets generating substantial passive income. You could retire early if you wanted. You could travel extensively. You could even buy a house with cash at that point if it still appealed to you. Most importantly, you'd have options and freedom. So what are the alternatives if you're not buying a traditional house during your wealth-building years? The simplest strategy is to rent a place that costs 30 to 50% less than a mortgage payment would, then invest the difference plus the down payment you didn't spend. If you're investing $700 to $1,000 monthly at historical market returns, you'll accumulate well over $1 million in 30 years. That's more wealth than the vast majority of traditional homeowners will ever build. Another approach is the house hacking strategy I mentioned earlier, buying a multi-unit property with a low down payment. Living in one unit while renting the others to cover your costs, then repeating the process. Do this successfully a few times over a decade, and you could own multiple income-producing properties worth several $million. Geographic arbitrage is another powerful strategy that's become more viable with remote work. If you can earn a high salary from an expensive city while living in a low-cost area, the savings rate can be extraordinary. You could potentially save $50,000 or more annually, reaching financial independence in your 40s or early 50s. Compare that to earning the same salary in an expensive city, paying high rent or a mortgage, and saving perhaps $10,000 yearly. That's the difference between retiring at 50 and working until 70. If you want real estate exposure without the burdens of ownership, real estate investment trusts offer a compelling alternative. You get real estate returns and dividend income with complete liquidity and none of the maintenance headaches. Or you could direct that down payment towards starting a business, which has the potential for returns that dwarf real estate appreciation. And finally, there's the approach that works consistently despite being boring, simply investing in low-cost index funds. $500 monthly invested over 30 years becomes over $1 million. It's not exciting, but it's far more effective at building wealth than traditional homeownership for most people. The pattern I've observed over decades is clear. People who rent modestly during their wealth-building years and invest the difference end up with significantly more financial freedom than those who bought houses early. Same starting point, same time frame, completely different outcomes. The difference comes down to understanding opportunity cost versus prioritizing the emotional satisfaction of ownership. Here's the truth that's difficult for many to accept. Buying a primary residence during your wealth-building years is primarily consumption, not investment. You're purchasing a very expensive place to live and telling yourself it's a smart financial move, but the math says otherwise. It's an emotional decision, and that's fine if you understand that's what you're doing. If you say to yourself that you know this house will cost you millions in opportunity cost, but you really want it and you're willing to pay that price, then at least you're making an informed choice. But most people don't understand this. They genuinely believe they're investing and building wealth when they're actually consuming wealth. They're trading money today and potential wealth tomorrow for the psychological benefit of ownership. Real investing makes you wealthier over time. Buying a house makes you poorer compared to what you could have achieved by investing that same money elsewhere. That's mathematics, not opinion. So if you're still in your wealth-building years, if you're not already financially independent, consider renting something modest and investing the difference. Build real wealth first. You can buy a house later with cash when you're financially free. But if you buy the house now, you may never achieve that freedom. I've watched thousands of people make this choice over the years. I've seen them trade potential financial independence for pride of ownership. I've seen them work well into their 70s because they spent their wealth-building years paying for a house instead of building investments. The real estate and mortgage industries have convinced most people that home ownership creates wealth. It doesn't for most people in most situations. It consumes wealth and limits opportunities. The sooner you understand this difference, the better equipped you'll be to make decisions that actually build lasting financial security, rather than just making you feel successful while limiting your actual potential. The choice is yours, but at least now you have the information to make that choice with clear understanding rather than accepting conventional wisdom that may not serve your best interests. If this perspective challenged your thinking or gave you something valuable to consider, I'd appreciate it if you'd hit that like button and leave a comment sharing your thoughts on this topic. And if you want more content that examines financial decisions from unconventional but mathematically sound angles, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss future videos. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.